There used to be a time, believe it or not, where these Brexiteers were once a force to be feared. They reckoned with force, that you daren't upset them. Because if you did, you would risk their wrath. And like some ancient god atop of Mount Olympus, they would be hurling down thunderbolts at the government consistently. We've even seen these Brexiteers take down governments on multiple occasions and be the downfall of multiple prime ministers. And this is only in recent history. And yet, this once all powerful force, this once almost godlike power and entity within the Conservative Party itself, the party within the party, the European Research Group, its power and its influence went almost instantly to a point where the Windsor framework, which it was riling itself up for to be a big showdown, to potentially, if it had failed, a lot of people were speculating at the time would be the end of Rishi Sunak, would be yet another victim of the ERG. Once again showing that these Brexiteers really still did have the power that they wielded, that they had this almost in complete control of the party. But what happened? They were seen off completely. And as we discussed at the time, that was a fault of their own making. So obsessed had they become about Brexit that they never had any plan. They never had any forethought beyond wanting to follow their own ideology. And even some of their own fellow, more soft Brexiteers, upon realizing this and seeing this, referred to them as it's okay, it's just those Brexit headbangers making some noise. But recently, we have seen a lot of very, very big and significant Brexit climb downs. So, what has been the reaction from these Eurosceptic Tory MPs, this once almighty and powerful group now laid low upon the benches of Westminster? Well, it once seems that this almost Cerberus-like entity that had terrified multiple Tory prime ministers has turned nothing now into a minuscule chihuahua, which is nothing but yapping on the back of the backbenchers, which, for all intents and purposes, Rishi Sunak and even the rest of the party are quite willing to ignore, which marks a very, very, very significant sea change in Conservative Party politics. That's for sure. So, before we continue, please do remember to click on that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And of course, as always, there is the YouTube thank you button and the Pony Club as well. And of course, thank you very much to everyone who does support the channel that way. So let's go on and find out about this. How have the Eurosceptics been reacting to all these monumental climb downs that they have been experiencing? So this comes from the Financial Times, the title of Rishi Sunak's Brexit climb downs rile Eurosceptic Tory MPs. So Conservative Eurosceptics on Friday turned on Rishi Sunak after a week in which the UK government shelved key post-Brexit policies intended to take back control of Britain's borders and regulations. Sunak instead invited Britons to view the benefits of Brexit through the bottom of a pint glass by visiting a beer festival to talk about how freedom from the EU had allowed him to hold down duty on draft beers in pubs. But as we talked about also that week, this big Brexit pub guarantee, the drinks industry is far from impressed of this being some sort of a Brexit benefit. And if anything, they're not very happy about it at all. Because while some alcohols have benefited, that's true, others have been very heavily punished for having a lot higher alcohol content. So the drinks industry is far from, shall we say, pleased by some of these changes. But away from the boozy photo op, some Tory MPs were much more focused on the less heralded post-Brexit climb downs being undertaken by Sunak's government on the regulations and borders. Sunak and Chancellor Jeremy Hunt said that they are focused on doing everything they can to cut costs for businesses to help fight inflation, awkwardly conceding in the process that aspects of Brexit are pushing up prices, which we always said it would do. This is the thing that we always get to when you see these Brexiteers. There was this reality which we always said existed, that if you do this, this will happen. So how do you intend to combat this reality? But instead, no, they clung to this fantasy and this ideology that if they do Brexit and we get rid of all this regulation, then we'll be in this magic fantasy land with rainbows and unicorns. But of course, this consistently has not happened. Instead, it has led to far more damage. And to be honest, we will give Sunak and Hunt at least some credit that they are at least economic realists. While they might be pro-Brexiteers in a sense, they aren't, should we say, full hardcore Brexiteers, that they are far more soft Brexiteers. And as a result, the hardcore and the softcore Brexiteers, while once united, have now very much split. And it turns out that there were a lot more soft Brexiteers than there were hardcore. And most of these soft Brexiteers actually, when push comes to shove, actually liked a lot of the stuff that they had when they were in the EU. So this is, I think, something we will really see continue to happen in the Tory party, because this question of Euroscepticism has been one that has continued to flummox many of the leaders of the Conservative Party, and it is a question that they have refused to really answer or even tackle head on. But it is one that continuously causes splits in the Tory party, and it is one that has caused the Tory party to split so much that they've become to the state where they are now. And I've talked before about how the massive opportunities that do lie before us before that. But anyway, let's get back to it. So, the Remain tendencies inside the Treasury have triumphed for the time being, and are tying us to EU regulations, said David Jones, the deputy chair of the pro-Brexit Tory European Research Group, saying it's very disappointing. This week, Kemi Badenoch, the business secretary, also ordered a retreat on Britain's plan for a post-Brexit revival to the EU's CE product quality mark, after business leaders had warned that the duplication would be costly and pointless. As again, we covered that as well just this week. Ministers then explained that the continued acceptance in Britain's safety standards set to Brussels would lead firms to focus their time and money on creating jobs and growing the economy. The very next day, the Financial Times revealed that ministers were also set to delay for a fifth time the plans to introduce the new regime paperwork checks at UK ports for animal and plant products coming from the EU. They said that the driving force for this is the need to bear down on inflation, said one government insider, admitting that imposing new costs at the border would push up prices of imported food. And remember, all this would be fine to the Brexiteer, because, to quote Jacob Rees-Mogg, well, what we do is we lower tariffs to zero. And of course, things like the World Trade Organization or any other country we potentially have with a trade agreement with would be having a lot to say about that. And of course, that would also have huge implications for our own industries here in the UK, should that happen. But of course, Jacob Rees-Mogg does not seem to care. about that. So, the ability for Britain to control its own rules and borders were the central tenets of Brexit. But Sunak, Hunt, and Badenoch have shown themselves willing to ditch the orthodoxy in search of growth to try and fight inflation. The government's latest announcements do signal a shift to a more pragmatic dealing with the consequences of Brexit, said Anton Spick, who also writes on the EU-UK relations at the Tony Blair Institute think tank. In doing so, the government has made its clearest admission yet that the costs of Brexit are inflationary and need to be reduced if ministers are serious about tackling rising prices. But some Brexiteers are seeing this sellout of Brexit principles, saying that part of the leaving the EU was to have our own regulatory regime that was more suited to UK conditions than EU ones, said Jones. We should be cracking on with that. But former Priti Patel, the former Home Secretary, also said that free from the grip of Brussels, we had a great opportunity to transform our country into a low-tax beacon of free trade. Something that Brexiteers always come out and say that that's what the opportunity for Brexit was, to become low tax and free trade, meaning no regulations, no tariffs or anything like that. This Singapore on the Thames view, to which many Brexiteers in 2016 were saying, no, that's not what we want to do at all. So once again, showing that they are lying, and that if they had been honest about that, what they wanted to do, which Priti Patel openly just there said, if she'd been more honest about what she'd wanted to do, people would not have voted for Brexit. It would have not have happened because people have gone, we don't really want to do that. That's not the direction we want to take the UK in. But delivering on that potential had now stalled, she said. Brexiteers also believed that Sunak had begun his retreat from his core Eurosceptic values back in February, when he agreed the EU withdrawal in the Windsor Framework, a deal to improve the post-Brexit trade rules covering Northern Ireland. The agreement conceded a role for the European Court of Justice in overseeing the accord, and of course, former Premiers Boris Johnson and Liz Truss were among the 22 Tory MPs who voted against it. As we said, the once mighty Eurosceptic core of the party that could easily marshal and shown that it could very get over 100, if not more, votes, showed that they could only get 22, and that was a completely abysmal showing for them. Their once mighty strength has fizzled out by the looks of it. And it has been because it has been met with the reality of the situation of what they are pushing for. And them pushing for this ideological stuff, which Liz Truss went along with and almost crashed the economy and destroyed the pensions industry. And we've talked about how bad that would have been many times this week as well. So, Sunak's rout, of course, of the Eurosceptics over the Windsor deal was followed by the decision in May to abandon the totemic promise of a review to scrap all retained EU law on the British Statute Book by the end of the year. Badenoch explained the climb down in a very stormy meeting with ERG members in May. And again, very, very interesting, where she said that she would not be an arsonist to their plans, because we knew what that would mean by going through with this crazy plan that the ERG wanted to go through for no other reason than just pure ideological reasoning. And it would have been insanity to go through with, but this is what the Brexiteers, the hardcore Brexiteers, really want to do, and it is something that they did not admit that they wanted to do. They said at the 2016, oh no, we're going to keep all our standards, rules, and regulations. But here we are having these Brexiteers who told us that we were going to keep the same standards, rules, and regulations, and that they were going to be infinitely better, saying that no, we want to get rid of all those standards, rules, and regulations. And that includes things like workers' rights, which they very often do not include and are honest about what they want to get rid of those rights that we gained from being part of Europe. So, but one ally of the minister has said that she was very unrepentant in trying to end the uncertainty and cut business costs. After her decision this week to also reinstate plans for the UK revival of the EU's safety mark for most goods sold in Britain, one ally of Badnoch said, "Businesses don't like it," she said. "Enough of this. Let's just sort it out." Jones said that he suspects that the decision to drop this key Brexiteer policies was made as part of a result of negotiations on the Windsor Framework. In other words, it was part of a broader deal with the EU. Hunt's allies have also insisted that these decisions are not about Brexit, but they are part of the government's focus on trying to weed out any policies that complicate the Bank of England's fight against inflation. Isaac Lodalvo, the Tory election advisor, has long warned that it would be very disastrous to try and fight the election with large parts of Brexit unresolved, having fought the 2019 contest on a promise to get Brexit done. Sunak is gradually trying to tick off some of these outstanding issues. Although the question of when to introduce full border checks of EU imports, they are already in place for trade going the other way, is still up in the air. And this is it. If they know, as has been admitted, that when you bring in these checks, it will be an increase in costs, will cause disruption, and have a lot of very negative consequences on the UK economy. This admittance that we've had 5 times that these checks are not going to be introduced is a clear admittance that this whole idea of this Brexit and taking back control was not going to work, that it was going to come with very significant costs to our economy. One of which the UK public was promised by the Brexiteers that Brexit would not cost anything, that nothing would change. In reality, a lot more has changed than the Brexiteers are even willing to admit. Sometimes they are, as we've even seen in this article from some of the Brexiteers quoted here. But other times, when they are confronted with their own reality, they can't even admit it and still continue to live on in this bizarre fantasy land. But Jacob Rees-Mogg, another Brexiteer, argued that when he was in the cabinet, that Britain could use its own Brexit freedoms to leave its borders open. Remember that? He said Britain should leave its borders open. So much for taking back control of those borders for safe imports from the EU and other countries with advanced regulations, such as the US and Australia. And that would be disastrous. The opportunities for smuggling would be absolutely insane because there are criminals in the EU, in the US, and Australia who would go, "Oh, we can report anything we want because the borders of the UK are open." Do you not think that criminals are going to take advantage of that? It's just another example of why these Brexiteers have no concept of reality and what on earth they are actually talking about. But the longer the UK border remains open, the more likely is that the issue will feature in the next year's election. Labour has already promised to negotiate a veterinary deal with the EU, reducing the need for more onerous checks. And Arthur Mencken, director of the UK in a Changing Europe, a think tank, welcomed what he called the sensible politics adopted by Sunak and his ministers in recent weeks in the face of the UK's economic problems. But he said, it's what you might call a rational Brexit. The question is whether, if you don't have the cost of living crisis, would you then go back to a more hardline, no compromise stance? And that is true. Would you then go back to a more hard, non-compromising stance later from maybe a future Tory party, or a Tory party espousing those hardline Brexiteer views again? It's very likely. But needless to say, Brexiteers are not happy. And most of this stuff that has been done, by the way, has been done very much during the summer where MPs are on holiday and they've managed to sneak this stuff out without the Brexiteers storming up and down the halls of Westminster, confronting Sunak in the House or Kimi Badenoch in the Commons. So it's been done very strategically, most of this stuff. And yet, this is a key abandonment of key Brexit principles and promises that, again, Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman all espoused, that doing all this stuff would be fantastic, but they haven't. You just saw there an admission by someone close to Kimi Badenoch saying businesses don't like it. Businesses don't want it. And we've even seen, and covered that last week, the sigh of relief that came from many of these businesses when that announcement came. And of course, the cost that many businesses had been preparing to take on because of this potential change that might have been coming. And now they don't have to. And I guarantee you, a year or maybe 2 years from now, we will get some sort of check or something, or survey to say, actually, how many UK businesses are actually using this UK mark? Because it's still there. It's just the EU one. The EU one is more valuable. It's worth more. It has more power on a product than the UK one. So, what's to say of these potential future Brexiteers? Well, ultimately, the project has failed. And this rational Brexit that we're now getting, it's not what was promised. And if you're rationalizing Brexit by not taking advantage of these, quote, Brexit freedoms, were they even freedoms to begin with? Were they even actual tangible benefits to even begin with? If you're saying, well, actually, we have to keep this because it's better for businesses. And we go back to the path that we always talked about. What's our path for rejoining the EU? Well, it's doing alignment deals, which then leads to the question of, why did we leave the single market and customs union? We end up rejoining the single market customs union. Then when we're in that, go, well, actually, we'd probably like a say over what goes on in these regulations and what goes on more in the EU. So we end up rejoining the EU. That's our path back, ultimately. And I've said it before, we are here a lot quicker in this situation than a lot of people initially thought. A lot of people said that it would be still another 5 or 6 years before we got to this point. So the fact that we are here already does really show the damage and effect of Brexit has been almost instantaneously. So there you go. Like I say, I think we'll be back in the EU a lot quicker than I think people really even thought or even expected. And as I've said many times, I want to be there when we do, because I tell you now, the salty tears that Farage will cry will be immense and so satisfying. And whose fault will it be? Well, it'll be his own and the Brexiteers, because they promised all this stuff. They knew it wasn't deliverable. They knew it was complete fantasy. And every time we warned them, if you do this, this is going to happen. So how are you going to avoid that exact thing from happening that we are warning you about? Oh, that's just Project Fear. Yeah, here we are with increased costs, rising inflation, a awful labour market at the moment, so many Brexit problems in this country going on. And I've said it before, you cannot have a legitimate conversation about how to improve the UK economy unless you actually generally talk about Brexit and the problems that Brexit has created in the UK economy. So we'll see what happens. Like I say, the next parliament, I've said it many a time, we're going to have a lot more Brexit conversations. And that's going to be very, very interesting going forward. Very interesting indeed. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.